in chapter 4, we talk about evolution and communities and how species interact. So are they getting along or not? Are they competing with each other or not? And what's that look like? As always, there's a case study and then a document-based AP kind of practice-free response questions. So by the end of the chapter, you should be able to do these things. This is another maybe checklist for you of stuff that you should be able to talk about. So on this page, some definitions include adaptation and evolution. Adaptations are acquiring traits that allow a species to survive better. And evolution is overall change in a species from one generation to the next. A key thing with both of those is that those don't happen to individuals, they occur in populations. So one individual does not evolve. A whole group of organisms, a whole population has to evolve. So there's change in a whole group and not just one individual organism. That's something a lot of people get confused when they start talking about evolution and what that looks like, especially when we have movies like, now I can't think of what they're called, X-Men, where individual people have developed these fantastic abilities, but it's not individual people that evolve it. It would be a whole group of people that would have to develop a change. So natural selection is the idea of what survives to pass on its genes. So what's going to survive to reproduce. And through the process of certain things dying off or not being able to reproduce, that's called natural selection. So natural selection is a driving force in causing evolution, because if something isn't fit to survive and can't compete well for food, it won't have any offspring, or it will have fewer offspring, so then there will be less of it in the next generation. So how many babies could something have? That's pretty much natural selection, okay? When we talk about evolution, another word you probably are familiar with is mutations. So that's changes in DNA. Those changes in DNA can lead to changes in overall traits or characteristics. The reason that those changes occur or become an advantage is because of selection pressures. So this is maybe change in temperature, or change in the availability of water, or change in what type of plants are available. And because of those selection pressures, that makes having a thicker fur coat better, or being able to store more water in your body an advantage. Otherwise, it doesn't matter. So if the environment doesn't change, then natural selection is not going to take place, because nothing's going to force that to happen. Okay. When we're talking about the stuff underneath this line, so critical factor and tolerance limits, this is the idea that things can only survive within a certain set of conditions. So we would not do too well on Mars because there's no atmosphere, it's really, really cold, we'd die. We can't tolerate that. So humans have a set tolerance for different environmental factors, and every species does. A critical factor is what one factor defines whether or not a species can live or exist in a certain area. Realistically, we know now that it's more than one factor that is combined to determine whether or not a species can live in a certain area. So, for example, the saguaro cactus, okay, looks like this. Maybe you've been out in the Sonoran Desert, which is like New Mexico, Arizona area. Maybe you've seen these before. Really tall, very big. They don't do very well in cold temperatures. So the place where they're distributed has to not drop below freezing for more than a few hours. So they live in a very narrow area when we're talking about the temperature that they're able to tolerate. Okay. Something that goes maybe without saying, but I wanted to mention it just in case you hadn't thought about it. Tolerance limits can be different for the young of a species versus adults. So what a baby can tolerate is different than what an adult of that species can tolerate. And that goes for maybe pH of water. If we're talking about fish, it could be temperatures of water. It could be even things related to like where in a tree that something can live. So where can birds be, or where are they able to survive? And that can be different for the young versus the old. Okay. I'm going to flip the page for a second and then come back because I want to show you this since we're talking about tolerance limits. This is an example of a graph that shows the tolerance limits for a species. So it doesn't really have much detail, but it does, this is in general what it would look like. So this is where the species is most abundant. This is where they survive and do really well. On either side of that, they can survive here, but they're not going to do well. They might not reproduce as much. They may not reproduce at all. So this is a place where it is stressful for them. And then further out on either side, you have a place where, yep, they're going to die. Okay, it's their zone of intolerance. So if they're there past a certain amount of time, they're just dead. Okay, no survival. And humans have this too. We have tolerance for how much sleep our bodies can get, or how little sleep we can get, how little water, how little food. It's not super ethical to conduct experiments on that for humans anymore though, so we don't generally do experiments with that. Coming back to this page, indicator species. These are species that are, for one reason or another, a good indication of the health of an area. So lichens and white pine are good indicators of whether or not there's air pollution. So if they're missing, then you know the air is polluted. Okay, trout, type of fish, they're a good indicator of whether or not the water quality is good. If they're missing, you know that there might be low levels of oxygen or the water is polluted with other chemicals. Okay. Bull thistle and plant weeds, these are kind of the opposite. If they're present, then you know that an area is being overgrazed. So cows, other cattle is spending too much time in that pasture because there are too many plant weeds around. There are a bunch of other examples of indicator species. These are just a few. You don't have to know these specific ones, but you should know what an indicator species is and be able to give a couple of examples. We will talk more about other types of indicator species when we start talking about pollution specifically, so we'll come back to this. Okay. And then habitat versus niche. Are you familiar with the term niche? Yeah? Maybe, sort of? Okay, so a habitat is just the place or what environmental conditions something can survive in. So it's kind of geography based. A niche is what's the organism's role? So what does it do? How does it interact with other things? And what's the environment that it can survive in? So it's a combination of its function kind of plus its habitat. So that being said, there are different types of creatures or organisms that can survive in different types of niches. So there are generalists and specialists. Generalists can survive in a wide range of conditions. So humans are generalists. We're able to adapt. We can wear clothing or wear less clothing if it's warm or cold, or I guess cold and then warm in that order. Bears are generalists. They can survive in a wide temperature range and they can eat a lot of different things. Pandas, on the other hand, are specialists. They only eat bamboo, and if they don't have that, then they're not going to survive. So they have one particular resource that they need. They have a very narrow niche. Another example of a specialist is the saguaro cactus. It only lives in the Sonoran Desert because of the temperature range and the environment that can support it. So things that are specialists are often also endemic. And that term endemic, you could say it's an endemic species, means it is only found in one area. So there are a lot of organisms that are localized to one place and you don't find anything like it anywhere else. Endemic. E-N-D-E-M-I-C. Okay. So if you want to represent that graphically, here's what that would look like. So we've got the black bear. It has this huge area it could survive in related to temperature and then how much rainfall is available. The giant panda is a specialist, so it's got this little tiny area. Okay.
So it won't try to eat anything else, it'll just die?
Yeah, and nothing else.
They're like dodos. Bizarre.
It's, yeah, it is the way that it is, unfortunately. That's the same for a lot of insects and other things too, though. That's not the only species that does that. The principle of competitive exclusion. This is the idea that two organisms can't use the same resources in the same way for any length of time. So if there is competition between two species for space or for food or for something like that, eventually one species will win out over the other, and the other species will either have to adapt, so it will have to evolve, because of the pressures on it to perform natural selection, or it will die. So if two species compete, the process of the species kind of separating what they're competing for is called resource partitioning. And that resource partitioning, that competition, can take place in either time or space. So you can have something that hunts insects at night versus something that hunts insects during the day. That's resource partitioning over time. Resource partitioning over space would be if we have a pine tree, where in the pine tree do different species live? So a really common example of partitioning over space are these warblers. So these are different types of the same species different species of the same type of bird. So they're all different warblers, and they live in different places, all in the same tree. So they're using the same resource, but they're using it in different ways, so they're not competing with each other anymore. At one point, they probably all competed for space, though. Okay. So then speciation. This is how we get species separating themselves from each other, so how we get differences. Sometimes that happens because they're isolated geographically. So the Galapagos Islands is a series of different islands that are far enough apart that finches on one island are different than finches on another island. They're separated in space, so they're literally far enough apart that they've grown different from each other.
Could that
If
be like
yeah.
bears, like polar bears?
Potentially, yeah. It depends on it depends on how the bears are related to each other and whether or not we think they co-evolved or evolved in different places, kind of on their own. But yes, it can be like that too. Yeah, that's a good example. So when that takes place, that kind of speciation is called allopatric speciation. Speciation. I can talk, I promise. It's called allopatric speciation, so that's here. If something develops different species in the same area, it's sympatric speciation. So it's happening at the same time in the same place. Okay, so allopatric is separated by distance, sympatric speciation is in the same place. And then there are 3 selection types. So these are different types of selections that can occur so that we can talk about how species become different from each other. So I'm going to move that up so you can see the graph, because I think the graphs make more sense. There's directional selection, and directional selection can go this way or this way. But if you were looking to graph it, you'd either have it moving this way or this way. Stabilizing selection means that your frequency of individuals gets higher, so the normal becomes more normal. So if the average shoe size is a 7, more and more people will have a shoe size of 7. That's stabilizing. So your normal becomes more normal. Your average becomes more like what everybody has. Disruptive selection is where you go from having, okay, here's the normal, to spreading apart from that. Okay, so those are the 3 different types of selection.
So would that be like the shoe size should be a 7, but people have 3s and 9s?
Yeah. Okay. And realistically, this is looking at things like beak length and wingspan and stuff like that. We're going to be done there because that's as far as I got, but